So I'm on my way back home from college when I notice that the car radio stops playing. I look to my right, I look to my left, and the lampposts, which should be on by now, aren't, well, on. I try to Google on my phone what is happening, but I have absolutely no service. Dang it, I thought. Not again, another blackout in the city of Caracas. Except that this time, the blackout was happening nationwide, and it would last for more than a week in most of the country. Little did we know also that that same night, many people in the city of Maracaibo in the northwest of the country would succumb to looting, murder, and power failures in hospitals. Back then, I was a student leader amidst the third wave of protests that had happened in the country since Nicolas Maduro inherited power from Hugo Chavez as part of the government that has driven Venezuela into hyperinflation and tons of violence, right? I'd say that the main leader of us was her, the one holding the mic, Rafaela Requesens, whose brother was tortured in a semi-public manner, something very gruesome. In any case, we were all unified in pro of a leader called Juan Guaido, who we recognized as the main leader against the Chavista government. Of course, just as we have accused the government of corruption many times, the leaders backing Guaido also succumbed to that in one way. And by the time the blackout happened, we were already months into these protests that didn't seem were gonna lead us anywhere again. You can imagine how depressing that moment was. Now, I want to emphasize that that was the third wave of protests that had been happening. This picture, which was very famous, is from the protests that occurred in 2017, which were quite massive. It was perhaps the year where the whole world started noticing more closely the tragedies we were suffering. And the first wave of protests in 2014 was when I entered college, right, during my first year. A moment where I really discovered from up close how repressive the government can be, and a moment in which I certainly gained my national or class consciousness in one way or another, right? After that year, 2014, was when people stopped talking about a Venezuelan diaspora and started talking more seriously about a refugee and migrant crisis, right? It wasn't just middle-class Venezuelans looking for economic opportunities, but stuff was getting definitely more complicated. The running joke back then was that when you went on a first date with someone, the first thing you would ask is, ¿Cuándo te vas del país? When are you leaving the country, right? So, blackout, let's go back to that for a while. We had no service on our phones during the first part of it. At one moment, someone discovered that if you parked your car on a specific point of the highway, you could get some bars. So some people would go randomly to the highway at night or at some point and look up in foreign publications what was happening in the country, right? You know, water distribution, of course, became a problem. It already was in many areas, but it was an even higher problem. So we resorted to the typical showering with pots and pans. And in the end, although many thought that this huge failure in the country's electricity grid would finally move the government to change, it did not budge, right? Eventually, some years later, I managed to obtain a scholarship to pursue my graduate studies in creative writing here in New York. And eventually, I became part of the Avenues, the WorldSchool community, which makes me quite happy. But here's the thing. Despite living in a country where we all saw our families grow poorer and poorer, you know, despite living in a country where on many occasions I and basically everyone I know had guns pulled up to our faces by cops or petty thieves, many family members as well were kidnapped from one moment or another, I was truly a privileged kid in this society. I never had to seriously worry about getting to eat 3 times a day. I graduated from high school and college, private institutions at that. And yes, I lived in an area that at night could get tense here and there, but it wasn't a place that was dominated by gangs as many other areas, as many other urban and rural areas in the country are. Most of the people that are living in extreme conditions of poverty, which is a huge number in Venezuela, live in barrios like these, where houses are super susceptible to environmental damages and where there is an immense lack of planning regarding services, right? The people that are in such dire conditions are the people that mainly compose the migrant crisis that we talk about today. Not people that are randomly looking to try again somewhere else, but people that have literally nothing to lose. Now, these people, as we know, our people, these human beings as we all are, have to traverse through the Darien jungle in Panama, where the situation is, of course, not easy. It's not an easy feat. I've been told about literally being afraid of the animals that are in the area, right? And some people who kind of know the jungle take advantage of others that don't. So some people also succumb to all types of abuses there. Eventually, once the walkers, right, los caminantes as we call them, or ourselves, get to the Rio Grande to cross into America, it's also not a simple thing. I've heard of mothers talk about how scared they were of being taken away by their currents, or seeing that someone's child or friend had to be in that situation. Now, some people wonder, perhaps skeptically, why do they have to come all the way here? Why do Venezuelans or other migrants simply not move to a neighboring country? We are doing that, right? Most of the Venezuelan migrant population is in Colombia. There are plenty of us as well in Chile, in Argentina, in Peru. But as we know, if we skim through the news a little bit, those are countries that also have important economic and political issues, right? On another hand, I firmly believe that we are all, in one sense, pseudo-citizens of the United States. Throughout the 20th century, the American media industry and the American government definitely moved towards the whole world consuming the cultural products of this country, right? You might grow up in Venezuela, you might grow up in South Africa, you might grow up in Taiwan, but we all consume American movies, American music, American TV shows, and read American books. In Venezuela, we don't really have lockers in our high schools or prom night, but Venezuelans from all across the class spectrum recognize that as images that are very typical of high school life. Heck, this guy is much more recognizable all over the world than certainly some indigenous icons are for people of their own countries. Now, if we get that image of America so much in our day-to-day, and especially an image of a country that sells itself as the greatest or one of the greatest in the world, a champion of human rights and democracy, evidently someone who is striving for this will look to that as a possibility, as a place where it is worth starting over. Now, as we know, many political disagreements, if we state it lightly, have led to a big issue regarding the position of migrants here in America, and especially here in New York, right? We know that many politicians in the South have bused and flown people all the way to New York since it's a sanctuary city, and there hasn't been able to occur a proper planning so that we address the needs of our migrant population, right? Very sadly, hotels, cruises, schools, and different types of places have had to be used as shelters, and as time goes on, migrants have less time in which they are able to be in these shelters. We know that the city has asked the federal government for aid, but it hasn't really received it, despite New York being probably the state that gives more tax money to the federal government and receives the less federal funding. And there's been a lot of fear-mongering as well about the possible safety dangers that migrants might represent in New York, but The NYPD reported last December that last year, deaths, murders, shooting incidents and burglaries actually were reduced, were decreased here in the city, right? We know very well that there's been a share of violent incidents in the subway these last years, but the perpetrators have not been Hispanic migrants, right? So what does that have to do with all of us? I want to go back to some ideas of Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset. In some of his books, he talks about how the concept of aristocracy, those who have privilege, was originally a dynamic one. It wasn't that you merely inherited a position in society. You had to move towards it. It was the result of an action, of a conquest. And in that sense, José Ortega y Gasset invites us to reconquer our privileges. And it is important to consider that a privilege isn't something natural, right? Or spontaneous. We have a certain privilege, and us members of this community definitely have so, because of the work that our parents or grandparents or people before that did, and the work that others did with them or for them. There is no privilege aside from society. We are privileged in relation to others, and in that sense, the responsible thing to do, if we are conscious of this, is to act towards the society that has made us who we are. And in that sense, I think that assisting the migrants in the city would be a great way for reconquering our privilege. After all, New York has historically been a city that has prided itself on its multicultural quality, right? In the early 20th century and the 19th century, we had very important immigration waves from Italy and from Ireland, and we all consider them as a very essential and great part of the city's identity right now. I don't see any major difference with this at the moment. So the time to act is now, and the future is now, right? The future happens just as we literally speak with every second that passes. There are great NGOs that has strived to work with migrants, like Via NYC, like Mil Mundos en Común. But on this topic, llover sobre mojado, to rain over what is wet, is not a bad thing to do. It seems that politicians won't really reach any agreement soon on how to help the migrants, so we can't just wait with our arms crossed. Let's act in any way we can. Raising awareness is just the first step. So listeners, what I propose is basically to not be entitled, but let's make our titles, our privileges, make sense. In a very New Yorker fashion, let's assist our migrants. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.